One of the most influential books of the 20th century is Space, Time, and Architecture, written by Swiss historian Sigfried Giedion. First published in 1941, the book quickly became one of the most important texts on the modern architecture. For many architecture students around the world, it has long been considered a kind of Bible on modern architecture. This book is not just a history of buildings, it is something more ambitious. Giedion tried to explain how architecture evolved together with science, technology, art, and society. To understand architecture, he argues we must understand space, time, and transformation of human perception. So who was the Sigfried Giedion? To understand the book, we must first understand its author. He was born in Switzerland in 1893. He studied engineering and art history, an unusual combination that would later define his intellectual approach. He was not simply an architectural historian. He was also deeply involved in the modern architectural movement itself. From 1928 to 1956, Giedion served as a Secretary General of the organization known as Congress International Architecture Modern, often abbreviated as SIAM. SIAM was the central meeting place of the modern architectural movement. Its members included some of the most famous architects of the 20th century like Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius. Giedion wasn't merely an observer of modern architecture, he was one of its key intellectual organizers. He served as the SIAM's secretary from its first meeting until its effective dissolution at the 10th meeting. In other words, he stood at the center of the modern architectural movement. The book itself originated from a series of lectures. In 1938, Giedion gave lectures at the Harvard University. These lectures eventually became the foundation of Space, Time, and Architecture, which was published in 1941. This means the book reflects the intellectual situation of 1930s. Modern architecture was still new. It wasn't yet universally accepted. In fact, modern architects were still fighting against traditional academic institutions. Understanding this historical moment is essential to understanding the tone of the book. This is not simply a neutral history. It is also a defense of modern architecture. So one of the Giedion's most important arguments is the unity of science and art. He believed the modern society had created a dangerous division. Science and technology were progressing rapidly, but art had lost its connection with them. These two domains were evolving separately, and in some cases, they were even in conflict. But this wasn't always the case. During the earlier periods of history, especially during the Renaissance, science and art were deeply interconnected. Take the example of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo was both an artist and a scientist. He studied anatomy in order to draw the human body more accurately. Artists of that time often had the medical knowledge because understanding the body was necessary for painting and sculpture. In other words, art and science once formed a unified worldview. Giedion believed that modern architecture had the potential to reunite these two domains. Architecture, after all, depends both on technical knowledge and artistic imagination. So Giedion describes architecture as a product of many interacting forces. He writes that architecture is shaped by social factors, economic conditions, scientific developments, technological innovations, Cultural traditions. Architecture is not determined by style alone, nor is it determined solely by social or economic conditions. Instead, architecture emerges from the relationship between many different elements. In modern art and architecture, the key factor is the interaction between these elements. This idea is extremely important. Architecture is not just about forms or decorations. It is about the structure of relationships within society and technology. So Giedion introduces an interesting distinction between two types of historical forces. He calls them constituent facts and transitional facts. Constituent facts are long-term tendencies that repeatedly reappear in history. Even if they are temporarily suppressed, they eventually return. In the 19th century, Giedion identifies several major constituent facts: new possibilities in structural engineering, the rise of industrial mass production, transformations in social organization. These developments were not temporary trends. They fundamentally reshaped architecture. On the other hand, transitional facts are temporary phenomena. They may appear impressive at first, but they lack lasting influence. In Giedion's view, many 19th century architectural styles belong to this second category. So Giedion's historical narrative began with the Renaissance. One of the key developments of this period was the discovery of perspective in painting. Perspective allowed artists to represent the space mathematically. This new understanding of spatial perception influenced architecture as well. Renaissance architects developed new methods of organizing the buildings and the cities. Figures such as Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci explored new possibilities in architecture and urban planning. Giedion traces how these ideas evolved through the Baroque period, especially in the design of urban spaces and public squares. Cities in Italy, France, and southern Germany developed sophisticated forms of spatial composition. Urban squares became important elements of civic life. These spaces were not accidental. They were carefully designed environments. So the next major transformation occurs in the 19th century. Industrialization introduces entirely new building materials and construction techniques. Among the most important innovations were iron and cast iron, large-scale glass production, skeletal structural systems, and modern bridges. These technologies dramatically expanded the possibilities of architecture. But according to Giedion, there was a problem. While industry and engineering were advancing rapidly, architecture lagged behind. Many architects continued to imitate historical styles rather than embracing new technological possibilities. Giedion highlights several architects who recognize the importance of new structural technologies. Among them are Otto Wagner, Auguste Perret, Tony Garnier. These architects were interested in structure and function rather than decoration. They explored the architectural potential of modern materials such as steel and reinforced concrete. In the United States, Giedion highlights two particularly important figures, Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. Sullivan famously declared that form follows function. This principle became one of the central ideas of modern architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright, Sullivan's former student, expanded these ideas into new architectural language. So Giedion also explored the influence of modern art. One particularly important movement was Cubism. Cubist paintings present multiple viewpoints simultaneously. Instead of representing a space from a single perspective, they combine many perspectives into a single image. This idea fundamentally changed how artists understood the space. According to Giedion, this shift in perception also influenced the architecture. Space was no longer seen as static and fixed. It became dynamic and relational. Another important artistic movement was Futurism. While Cubism explored new ways of representing space, Futurism focused on movement and time. Futurist artists tried to capture the speed, energy, and dynamism of the modern life. Together, Cubism and Futurism expanded the human perception. They allow people to think about architecture in terms of space and time together. This is exactly the concept expressed in the book, the title. So Giedion then turns to the architects who shaped the modern architecture. One of the most important figures is Walter Gropius, founder of the famous design school known as the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus attempted to unite the art, technology, and industrial production. It represented exactly the kind of the synthesis that Giedion believed was necessary of modern society.
The next major section of the book turns to the work of Le Corbusier. The Giedion begins by discussing the relationship between Le Corbusier and modern painting. Before becoming famous as an architect, Le Corbusier was deeply involved in the world of modern art, and his thinking was strongly influenced by developments in modern painting. This connection between architecture and modern art was important for Giedion because it demonstrated how changes in artistic perception were shaping architectural space. After establishing this relationship, Giedion explains one of Le Corbusier's most famous theoretical contributions, the 5 points of modern architecture. These principles proposed a new architectural language made possible by reinforced concrete construction. They included ideas such as pilotis, free plans and free facade, ribbon windows and roof gardens. Together, these ideas formed a framework for a completely new type of architectural space. But Giedion doesn't only discuss Corbusier's theoretical ideas. He also introduces one of the most dramatic episodes in the history of modern architecture, the 1927 League of Nations design competition. The competition was organized to select the design for the headquarters of the League of Nations in
Geneva. Architectural competitions are a common method for selecting a major project. Architects from around the world submit proposals and the jury select the best design. In this case, the competition attracted enormous attention. A total of 377 proposals were submitted. Among them, the proposal by Le Corbusier and his cousin Pierre Januet received the highest prize from many observers. However, the project was ultimately rejected. One member of the jury claimed that Corbusier's submission violated the competition rules. The violation was surprisingly minor. The drawings had been submitted as blueprint copies rather than the original ink drawings. Because of this technical issue, the proposal was disqualified. Giedion strongly criticized this decision. He argued that the rejection of Corbusier's proposal was not simply a procedural matter. Instead, he described it as a political conspiracy within the French architectural establishments. This event, according to Giedion, revealed a deep conflict between modern architects and traditional academic institutions. The full story would later play an important role in the formation of Congrès International Architecture Moderne, the international organization that brought modern architects together. Giedion then turns to the work of Mies van der Rohe. In the section, he reviews many of his work. These include his early country house project. the famous housing exhibition in Stuttgart, and later works such as the campus of the Illinois Institute of Technology. Giedion also discusses the Mies experiment with high-rise apartment buildings and office towers. Through this project, Mies explored the architectural potential of modern structural systems, particularly steel frames and glass facades. Another architect he discussed in this section was Albert Aalto. Giedion held Aalto's work in particularly high regard. Among Aalto's buildings, he gave special place to the Paimio Sanatorium in Finland. The building was designed as a tuberculosis hospital, and every detail, from the orientation of the rooms to the design of the furniture, was carefully considered in relation to the patients and health and comforts. For Giedion, Aalto demonstrated how modern architecture could combine technological innovation with deep concern of human experience. Giedion identifies 3 works that he considers especially central to the rise of modern architecture. The Bauhaus building by Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier's proposal for the League of Nations headquarters in Geneva, and Aalto's Paimio Sanatorium. Together, these projects represented different aspects of the emerging modern architectural movement. The final part of the book discusses the role of science. Modern architects were not simply designing the buildings. They were also fighting against the traditional academic institutions. These institutions promoted the classical architectural styles rooted in the tradition of École des Beaux-Arts. Modern architects believe these institutions were blocking architectural progress. The creation of science represented an attempt to unite modern architects in their struggle against academic conservation. It is difficult to overstate how influential space, time, and architecture became in architectural education. After its publication in 1941, the book spread rapidly through universities in Europe and the United States. For several decades, it became one of the standard textbooks used in architectural schools. Students studying architecture were not only learning how to design the buildings, they were also learning how to understand architectural history through Giedion's framework. His narrative of architectural developments was extremely powerful. According to this narrative, architecture evolved through a historical process, the move toward modernism. The Renaissance introduced a regional understanding of space. The Industrial Revolution introduced new technologies and materials. Modern architecture emerged as a logical response to these historical forces. In the story, architects such as Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and Frank Lloyd Wright were presented not simply as talented designers, but as the inevitable leaders of architectural progress. For generations of architecture students, this narrative became the standard way of understanding modern architecture. In many universities, architectural history courses followed a similar structure to Giedion's book. Students would learn Renaissance spatial concept, Baroque urban space, 19th century industrial technology, early modern pioneers, and finally the triumph of the modern architecture. Because of this influence, space, time, and architecture shaped the worldview of several generations of the architects. Many modern architects first encountered architectural history through Giedion's interpretation. The book helped establish the idea that modern architecture was not simply a style. It was a historical destiny of architecture in the industrial age. However, as time passed, many scholars began to criticize Giedion's interpretation. The main criticism is that his history is not neutral. Instead, it is a selective narrative designed to support the modernism. Throughout the space, time, and architecture, Giedion focuses almost entirely on architects who contributed to modern architecture. Architects associated with classical traditions or decorative styles are often ignored. For example, 19th century architecture included many important works influenced the Beaux-Arts tradition. Yet these architects receive very little attention in Giedion's narrative. Similarly, movements such as the Art Nouveau appear only briefly and are often described in a somewhat dismissive tone. This selectivity led critics to argue that Giedion's book is not really a general history of architecture. Instead, it is a history written from the perspective of the modern architectural movement itself. In other words, it tells a story of architecture as modernists wanted it to be told. Another criticism concerns the idea of historical inevitability. Giedion's narrative suggests that modern architecture emerged naturally and inevitably from technological and social change. But later, historians pointed out that history is rarely so simple. Architecture does not follow a single linear path. Different styles, traditions, and ideas often coexist. Some historians therefore argue that Giedion's book simplified the complexity of architectural history. But still, these criticisms do not mean that space, time, and architecture is unimportant. On the contrary, they highlight just how influential the book was. The book helped establish the modern architecture as a dominant narrative of the 20th century. But later generations of historians began to question the narrative. By the 1970s and 1980s, new architectural movements such as the postmodern architecture began challenging the authority of modernism. At the same time, historians started re-examining architectural tradition that Giedion had largely ignored. This shift didn't erase the Giedion's influence. Instead, it turned the space-time and architecture into something even more interesting. The book became both a classic work of the architectural theory and a historical document of the modern movement itself. Reading it today allows us to understand not only the development of architecture, but also how modern architects understood their own historical mission. So what is the ultimate message of space and time and architecture? At its core, the book argues that architecture cannot be understood in isolation. Architecture evolved together with scientific discoveries, technological innovations, artistic movements, social transformations. The modern world introduces the new ways of perceiving space and time. These changes reshaped the architecture. Modern architecture emerged not as a stylistic choice, but as historical necessity. For Giedion, the architects of modernism were responding to the realities of industrial society. Steel, reinforced concrete, elevators, and mass production demanded the new architectural forms. Architects had to evolve. In this sense, the book is not simply a history of buildings. It is a history of modern consciousness. That is why space-time in architecture became so influential. It provided a powerful narrative explaining why modern architecture existed and why it mattered. Even today, the book remains a landmark in architectural theory. It reminds us that architecture is not just about designing buildings. It is about understanding the relationship between human perception, technology, and society. And that relationship continues to shape the space in which we live. Thank you for watching, and I hope this summary helps you, and hope you will have the opportunity to read the actual text and learn more about it. And still, we are just halfway up the ladder of the knowledge of all of architecture, art, philosophy, and design. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.